definitely nothing wrong with reading more of the Bible. All right, I want to tell you a story about Sharon and Steve. They met at a Bible study while they were in college. The way Sharon puts it, there he sat with a Bible in his lap, Jesus in his heart, and me wrapped around his little finger. 3 months later, they were engaged. 6 months after that, they were married. That's even faster than my wife and I, and we were pretty fast. The following year, they began to pray about where they would live and work after graduation. They prayed, they fasted, they toured various towns, and looked at many opportunities. After several months, they felt certain God was calling them to a little town called Pineville, just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where Steve managed to secure a job. So after graduation, they moved to Charlotte and they set up house in a tiny apartment near the office where Steve would be working. The rent was half price for the first 3 months, a huge bonus for a young couple with nothing but student debt. Life was great. However, when Steve went to the office to finalize his work schedule and management particulars, a trap door opened beneath his feet. Not literally. Steve, I've been thinking about it, the potential partner began. I don't think this is such a good idea after all. I've changed my mind. And for the record, this is a true story. He extended his hand to the stunned 25-year-old and said, "Good luck to you, son." When Steve went home and told his wife the news, they were both shell-shocked. "What do you mean he changed his mind?" Sharon cried. "He can't do that. We just moved here. He made a commitment." A host of raw emotions collided with real questions for God. How could we have been so wrong? Didn't we hear you correctly? We prayed, we fasted, we wanted nothing more than to do what you wanted us to do, where you wanted us to do it. And now here we sit in a new city with debt, no jobs, and seemingly no future. What are we supposed to do? Steve and Sharon did not like this story. And they just wanted to serve God, and now they felt that God had left them high and dry. So here's a quick question for you. Have you ever felt that way? I have. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, at some point in our lives, we've probably felt left high and dry after trying to serve God, and things just didn't work out the way we hoped they would. Everything seems to be going well, and then that rug gets pulled out from under you. You have a nice life, a good paying job, a big house, a beautiful family. And then suddenly your company is downsizing and you get laid off. Or you're finally managing to get ahead with your bills and save up a little bit of money. And then your car breaks down and it's going to cost thousands to fix or buy a new one. Or maybe you're set to enjoy retirement years with your spouse, and then one of you gets sick with cancer, dementia, heart problems. And now your lives are filled with anxiety and uncertainty. You're just trying to obey God, but everything seems to fall apart. Maybe it's something extreme like I've mentioned, or maybe it's something smaller, but still painful. I think we have all had moments where we're just trying to live obediently to God, and we end up feeling let down or abandoned. And the Bible contains many stories about people who could probably relate. But I want to focus on just one of those today, on Joseph, on chapter 3 of the story, which I hope you've read by now, because we've had about 3 weeks to read it. Jacob, also known as Israel, Well, first let me backtrack for a second. We're going to talk about 3 points of injustice in Joseph's life. First is, he was obedient but hated. So Jacob, also known as Israel, has 13 sons. And Joseph is the 12th born, and he's only 17 years old or so when the story picks up with him. When we first meet Joseph, it says he's out pasturing the flock with his brothers. And the very first thing we see Joseph doing is bringing a bad report about his brothers. He's ratting them out. Dad, they're doing something bad. And I'm sure to him and to Jacob, he was just being an obedient son. But to his brothers, and if we've had brothers, we can relate, he's just a tattler. In response, Jacob gives Joseph a beautiful coat of many colors. Genesis 37, 3-4 says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that, I question Israel a little bit. I mean, we know you shouldn't have favorites among your children, but he could have loved Joseph the most in secret. Instead, he makes it obvious to all of his other children, and nothing good comes from it. Joseph ends up having 2 dreams from God. And he tells his family, also maybe not the best choice, but he tells his family about it, and it says that his brothers hated him even more and were jealous of him. In both of his dreams, Joseph sees his brothers and even his father bowing down to him. Now, when you're jealous and angry at your brother, you do not want to hear that he had a dream about you bowing down and obeying him. At least I don't. Everything, but for Joseph, in his, perfect little world, everything is looking up, right? He's been obedient to his father and to God, and he has received these amazing dreams promising something rather spectacular. But then he loses everything. Israel sends Joseph to check up on his brothers, and he obediently goes. Genesis 37, 18-20 says, his brothers, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits." That seems like a pretty extreme response to me. No matter how jealous I've been of my brother, I never actually thought about killing him. But things are different, I guess. But Reuben, he speaks up and he convinces them not to actually kill Joseph, but to throw him into a pit. And says, he's planning to rescue him later and give him back to his father. And so they throw Joseph into a pit, and then they sit down to eat, and Reuben seemingly goes off somewhere because he's not there. And then some Ishmaelites come along, and the brothers decide to sell Joseph and make some money off of him. And they come up with this elaborate story about a wild animal and convince Israel that Joseph is dead. Meanwhile, Genesis 37:36 says, "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him," that being Joseph, "into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." So this brings us to the next stage in Joseph's life and the next big injustice, where Joseph is honorable but slandered. So fast forward roughly 11 years. Joseph is a young adult slave, and he's working in the home of a high official in the Egyptian courts named Potiphar. And Genesis 39 gives us a report that Joseph honored the Lord and worked hard at what was assigned to him. Verses 2 through 4 reads, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all he had." You know, at this point we think, finally, some justice for Joseph. You know, I don't know about you, but I think we like this part of the story, right? It feels right. This is how it's supposed to be, isn't it? You faithfully serve the Lord, and he blesses you, right? And even when severely tested, we see Joseph shining. Genesis 39, verses 6 to 8, and then verse 10 read, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." I don't know if you've noticed this, but anytime the Old Testament talks about how attractive a person is, it never ends well. "And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused." And then verse 10 says, "And she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her." This woman is persistent, but Joseph continues to resist. And then one day, when no one else is around, she tries again, and she even grabs his clothes so that he can't leave. And Joseph, and he's got to be having every rationalization known to man going through his head to sleep with her, decides to run away. He is so desperate to get out of there and avoid sin. And he actually leaves his coat behind. He leaves in such a hurry. Potiphar's wife does not take it well. She tells the men of the household and her husband that Joseph tried to rape her. And Potiphar places Joseph in prison with Pharaoh's prisoners. So a special prison, not just the common prison that most people go to. And now, for the second time, Joseph tried to follow God's will, and he got what seems to be a pretty raw deal for it. He should have been honored for his virtue, and she should have been shamed. Instead, Joseph is punished, and she seems to get away with it. Psalm 105:18 actually gives us some more detail and says, "His feet were hurt with fetters, and his neck was put in a collar of iron." He wasn't comfortable. And this isn't the last time Joseph faces injustice. We see this third big injustice where Joseph is used of God for good, but then forgotten, at least for a time. Sometime later, after Joseph is thrown in prison, he is used by God and forgotten, right? Genesis 39 closes by telling us that God was in that prison with Joseph. Verses 21 to 22 tell us that the prison keeper actually put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. And verse 23 adds that the keeper paid no attention to anything in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. We see a pattern here. In chapter 40, we see two of Pharaoh's officers wind up in prison, and they actually get assigned to Joseph. And we read that both men had rough nights full of dreams that continue to trouble them in the morning. And when Joseph learns that, he says in verse 8, "Do not interpretations belong to the Lord? Please, tell them to me." And so the cupbearer goes first. And you can read about that in verses 9 through 11, along with Joseph's God-given interpretation in verses 12 through 13. But to summarize, Joseph's conclusion is that within 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to the king's service. And then we see Joseph making his plea here. It's, remember me and mention me to Pharaoh when you get out. I was kidnapped and I'm innocent. And then the baker goes next, and Joseph informs him he's going to be executed in 3 days. Probably not what the baker was hoping to hear after the cupbearer's news. 3 days later, everything happens the way Joseph said it would. God used him to reveal the meaning of these dreams. And then the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. Joseph sits in that prison for 2 more years. This is one of those stories where I often have read it and glossed over the details. But think about that. Like, can you even imagine what Joseph is feeling right now? 3 times! 3 times something like this has happened. 3 times he has been faithful and obedient to God, and 3 times he was offered a little bit of hope, seemingly, and then it all comes crashing down. You know, one day I'm going to rule over my brothers. Nope, now I'm a slave. I'm serving well and my master has rewarded me. Nope, now I'm in prison. God used me to give the cupbearer good news. Any day he'll get me out of here. Nope, it's been 2 years. I mean, that talk about confusing and disappointing. But Joseph continues to be faithful. And then we read in Genesis 41 that 2 years later, Pharaoh has some troubling dreams. None of the wise men, the magicians, anybody can interpret them. Then the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And this is where we see that those injustices God intended for good. So the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Can you imagine that? Oh man, Joseph. Hey Pharaoh, there's this guy that I met 2 years ago in prison. So Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and God gives Joseph the interpretation. And Joseph gives God the glory. And he explains to Pharaoh, after hearing his dreams, there is going to be 7 years of plenty. And then 7 years of horrible famine. And Pharaoh places Joseph in charge of Egypt, because according to verse 38, in him is the Spirit of God. Even Pharaoh can see this. And now Joseph is second only to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. And then it gets even better. In chapter 42, Joseph's brothers, those guys who sold him into slavery out of jealousy, they actually come looking for food because of the famine. And now over the next 3 chapters, we read about the many tests Joseph puts his brothers through without revealing who he is. And then finally, he reveals himself, and they are terrified. They throw themselves down before him, like in that dream he had all those years ago. And Joseph says to them in Genesis 45, verse 5, and then verse 7, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth." I mean, talk about a gracious, God-honoring response. I'm not proud of it, but even after all those years, I'm not sure I would really be over what they did to me. But Joseph sees God's hand in all of it. And so then Joseph's family, 66 people at the time, they all move to Egypt. Joseph's reunited with his father finally, and he gets to provide for his family and lead all of Egypt. Eventually, Joseph's father dies of old age, and his brothers start to worry again. And Joseph says in Genesis 50, the second half of verse 19 to verse 20, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive." At this point, we see God's plan in all of it. All those times when things were seeming to fall apart, God was at work doing something. God used those events, things caused by other people and their selfishness or their anger or whatever. He used those events to get Joseph where he needed to be for each step of the plan. He uses Joseph's brothers and their actions to get Joseph to Egypt, where he'll someday save his people. And when he's in Egypt, he elevates him enough in status that when things go south, he ends up in a special prison for Pharaoh's prisoners, where he meets the cupbearer. And then he uses the forgetfulness of the cupbearer to make sure Joseph is revealed to Pharaoh at the perfect time to earn his favor and get Joseph placed in power to save his people and many others. Why? Well, I just said it, but to save lives. To rescue God's chosen people from the coming famine and to get them where they need to be. Joseph is the next step in God's amazing plan of salvation. And he uses Joseph to provide for his chosen people, the ones who he will work his plan through over the many centuries. And he uses Joseph to get his people to Egypt and set them up for the next stage, the next chapter of the story of God's plan of redemption for humanity. And I gotta point this out again, but I love Joseph's line. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." I mean, what an amazing statement. Through all of this, I think Joseph has learned two things. People will fail you. God will never fail you. God used the things that were evil for good. And through Joseph's difficulty, he saved the nation of Egypt and the budding nation of Israel. And ultimately, through saving those people, he eventually saves us all. People will fail you, but God will never fail you. I want you to cling to that. Cling to Joseph's words. "You, people, meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Follow Joseph's example. Whatever difficulties happen to you, and we can have some horrible times. Thankfully, it doesn't look like any of us are going to be sold into slavery and put into prison, but you never know. Even if you have to white knuckle it in the bad situations, continue to be faithful to God like Joseph did. And God will show up. He won't fail you. Now, I'll be honest. It could take a while. We want God to show up immediately. At least I do, because I'm not the most patient person in the world. Ask my wife if you don't believe me. It was several years of ups and downs for Joseph. But we see him continuing to remain faithful to God and to do his best for God, And God kept showing up until he finally showed up in a huge way. Keep the conviction that whatever happens, God reigns over all the details of your life, from the greatest to the smallest. Whatever people intend for evil, God can and will eventually work for good. Let me say that again. Whatever is happening, as hard as it is to believe, God will eventually use it for good. God used the suffering and the difficulty in Joseph's life to save an entire nation of people and further his huge plan of salvation. So think about that. And then stop and ask yourself, what could God be using my circumstances for? We're probably inclined to believe he's not going to use our circumstances to save a nation, and would probably be right. But you never know. God saved a nation through Joseph's circumstances. What could he be using your circumstances for? Remember those people we talked about in the beginning, Steve and Sharon? 3 months after the devastating news that Steve's job fell through, a position opened up that had not been available when they were originally looking for a job. And now, according to Sharon, if they had written out their best case scenario for their lives, this situation would exceed it by far. Remember that rent that was half price for the first 3 months? It was 3 months to the day when Steve started this new job. What could God be planning for you? I don't know what you're going through right now. You could be in a time of blessing, or you could be in a time of struggle. Either way, I want to give you a practical challenge. Every day, either at the start of your day or the end of your day, whichever works best for you, stop and think of at least one, maybe even 3 ways that God has been good to you in your life. And just remind yourself of that. If you're having a good time right now, you're practicing for when things are tough. And if you're having a tough time right now, hopefully reminding yourself of all the good, all the ways God has been good to you, will encourage you and remind you that God is always good, and eventually he will show up. So try and practice that every day, just to, help our perspective, to help us through the hard times when they come. And remember, above all, people will fail you, but God will never fail you.